Welcome to the Managing Uncertainty podcast. This is Bryan Strawser, still the chief bottle washer here at Bryghtpath.
This is Bray Wheeler, still senior consultant and apparently still not bottle washer here at Bryghtpath.
This is episode 174, and we're coming up on the end of this calendar year. And I think there's a lot of uncertainty about the economy. We have some folks say we're in a recession. We have some folks who are saying we're definitely not in a recession. We're seeing, I think all year, we've seen a realignment of the coming out of the pandemic, if that's what we are. We've seen this realignment of the relationship between the employer and employees.
Yep.
And now we're seeing, as we're heading into the next year of 2023, we're starting to see layoffs, reductions in force, downsizing of real estate footprints, and cutting back on budgets. There's been a lot of that announced just in the last 24 or 48 hours here as we're recording this episode in early November. So I thought what might be interesting to talk about is, as business continuity and crisis management, crisis comms professionals, resiliency professionals, you're probably already in your budget season if you haven't already worked on your budget for next year. And so I thought we could talk a little bit, Bray, about how are we thinking about next year? And what do we think resiliency professionals need to be thinking about when it comes to their program?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a different way of sort of viewing, the planning cycle, in particular because sort of during the height of COVID or, over the last 2.5 years, there's been a lot of emphasis on business continuity and crisis management and resiliency planning and sort of all the things that go in there because the nature of the pandemic and, whether or not your organization had those capabilities or not. Now there's sort of a kind of a shift, not necessarily away from it, but just a totality shift in business, in the economics of everything. How do you sort of make your programs now resilient a little bit to what the next year sort of looks like and kind of wait to see what 2024 might look like?
So one thing that you've undoubtedly heard us talk about before, and is something that you need to think about before we can get into the exercise we want to talk through, is that your business continuity, crisis management, resiliency program, you have to make sure that program is aligned to your organization's strategies. You have to be in line. And by in line, I mean that you have an understanding of what your organization is trying to accomplish this year, next year, 5 years from now. So your company's mission, vision, strategic goals, and objectives, however your company talks and communicates about that. Or the things that we're about to talk about aren't going to work. So you have to start there. You have to think about, where's my company going, and what is the role for resiliency in helping the company achieve those goals?
And if you've set up these capabilities or your programs correctly, that's already a factor. So now it's just a matter of adapting what you've already done and what you've sort of already built upon and adjusting it. And if you haven't done that, that is I was nodding profusely as you were talking, Bryan, like that is a must do action before you can really do anything else. I mean, even if you're thinking about just maturing the program, and this isn't an exercise, that the exercise we're about to talk about, if it's not something that you even need to do, you still have to get that alignment set. Like that is fundamental basics.
So once we have that in place, and that could be a long, hour-long podcast conversation. Yes. Here's the framework that we've been using with clients thinking about next year. And a lot of our clients have come to us and said, I'm being challenged, as everyone at my company is, to cut our expenses by X percent. Pick a number. I've heard numbers as low as 3 and 4, and I've heard numbers as high as 20 to 30. How do you recommend I do that from a business continuity, crisis management, crisis comms perspective? And in each of those, we really come back with 4 buckets.
Yeah.
And in most cases, we've been able to work with our clients to lay this out on one piece of paper.
Yeah.
And the buckets that we use, and we'll talk through these. The first one is your core program. What do you have to do by policy? You should make sure your policy is good and properly aligned. But what do you have to do from a policy perspective that also satisfies your audit, compliance, regulatory certification, government regulation requirements for your program? Those are the things that you have to do. That's your core program. That's how we think about that. The second category, and we'll go back through these.
Yeah.
The second category are components that you think are value added. They are worth the investment to keep doing. They're worth the investment because they return a value to the organization that enhances your resiliency in a meaningful way. And you don't want to give those up. You're going to protect these.
Potentially profitable way.
Yeah, they may even create, some profit for the organization. The third category, so category 3 and 4 are the ones that you really need to pay attention to. Category 3, the third bucket here, is simplify. This is where you need to set aside the way that you have done some things in the past and think about how you can simplify this for the coming year. And then lastly, my favorite bucket, cut or stop. What are the things that you're doing that are not part of your core program? They're not value added. You can't simplify them in a way where it makes sense to keep doing them, and it's time to let them go.
Yep.
So we've used this framework. I'm serious in that it's nothing more than 4 columns on one PowerPoint slide, and we've laid out the program components in that way. And this has worked really successfully for our clients to explain what they're doing to respond to the budgetary and expense challenges. And honestly, you should be doing this every year anyway, even if we weren't in the economic situation that we are.
Yeah. And I think the way that sort of tooting our own horn here, but the way that we've sort of framed these up, I think, initially when we were having these conversations on how to approach this with different clients who were asking for it, we were sort of laying this out, and it felt sort of like the more traditional, like start, stop, continue sort of exercises and things like that. But then we really got to a point in the conversation of that doesn't really, it doesn't work and it feels like business jargon. This really feels more narrative, but also more action orientated to what it is that you're trying to accomplish, and really allows you to look at your programs holistically and understand what each component does for you or does not do for you. Mm-hmm. To your point, Bryan, where it just as important as core is the things that doesn't add value anymore, or needs to be owned somewhere else in the organization. And so maybe you stop doing it, but someone else needs to pick it up. And so you're kind of shifting maybe some of the budgetary or, compliance requirements to somewhere else, but that's what makes sense in looking at your own program and your own budget and your own slice of the organization and what you're doing for it.
So let's walk through these in a little more detail.
Yeah.
So the first bucket is the core program. What are the things that you have to do because they are required by policy? And we're assuming here that you've taken a look at your policy and revised it appropriately given the challenges in front of your company. But what's required by policy? What's required from a audit or compliance or certification, regulatory compliance, government regulation? What are those things you got to do? You still have got to manage your project or program, and that's got some overhead about, metrics and meetings and things that you've got to do. Governance meetings, for example. These are all things that you probably have to do. So big parts of this from a crisis or BC standpoint might be your business continuity life cycle. I still got to create and update plans. I probably still have to do BIAs.
Yep.
Maybe depending on your business, you could switch your BIAs to every 2 years instead of every year. So that might be more of a simplification thing. You've still got to update plans. You still got to update your crisis plans. You got to make sure all that stuff is still current, it's still applicable, it's up to date. Those are table stakes. That's how you really have to think about this bucket.
It's the non-negotiable, necessary items within that program. The motor has to run, and the vehicle has to get somewhere. So you need the motor, you need the steering wheel, and you need the tires. Probably need the brakes. But
my car works just fine. I drive a Chevy. You've got the Ford sitting out in the parking lot.
I do. Mine's fine. Minus a little rust here and there.
Maybe there's exercises that you have to do from a requirement policy compliance standpoint, and then there's your regulatory frameworks you may have to follow. If you're, maybe you deal with medical information, so you're high trust certified, and this is your year to recertify. 2023 is the year you have to recertify. You can't escape that without giving it up, and your company is not going to want to give that up.
No.
So you have to do the work to produce the evidence and go through the audit process to comply with those controls. So when we talk about your core program, it really is, it's the table stakes. It's the things that you must do. And these are the things that you're not going to cut. You might find some ways to simplify them or do them differently, but you're not getting rid of them.
Yep.
You can't get rid of them. Your next step is, the next bucket again is the value added components. So what are the things that you're doing that you believe and your stakeholders believe add value to the organization?
That last part is key.
Yeah, don't make it just about you. What do your stakeholders think?
Getting their buy-in, engaging them as a part of this conversation is huge to not only the success of the program, but just to demonstrate the value to the organization and to have broader conversations even beyond, this sort of exercise. You've allowed that conversation to happen in this forum, but really now that's a narrative you can use beyond budget conversations.
So one of the things we think about here is that for almost every company, it makes sense. It's a value-added effort to have your crisis management team get together on a monthly or quarterly basis or every other month basis. You got to figure out the cadence for your organization. But there's value in having them converse and talk about recent incidents, learn something new, continue to be used to working together and collaborating on issues and practicing exercises, drills. You don't have to make this overly complicated, but an hour every month, an hour every other month, an hour once a quarter. These are valuable things that build muscle memory with those teams.
I think the dark side of, that particular value add is heading into uncertain times. There are inevitable transitions of folks and transitions of portions of the organization. These moments allow you to build that resiliency either through bringing backups up to speed or new members up to speed or shifting the way that you work as a group based on the changes within the organization. So your cross-functional collaboration might look different, might need to look different. Having these as sort of planted moments throughout the year allows you to better understand the organization as it shifts and evolves, particularly if, 2023 is, as turbulent as everyone thinks it might be. It's a good opportunity to bring everybody back together.
Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of things that add value. I think that this is an area where you have to be willing to take a really hard look when you get past your core program and you start thinking about what's value added. Be judicious in deciding that things aren't.
Yes.
What do you think doesn't add value? And be willing to put that in one of the other buckets. Or is there something that you think is value added, but you could approach it differently? And then you can simplify and you can put it in that bucket.
Or it's a space of the program that has already been recognized as needing a change or
an upgrade,
or you want to do something different, but you see the eventual value in it. Now you have the opportunity to make that change, saying, well, we need to do something different here in order to get the value, and you end up sort of driving that component where you wanted it to go in the first place, and you've used this moment as the catalyst to do so. So there's potential opportunity as well, But to your point, Bryan, this is where you really have to take a hard look and
be honest with yourself.
Be honest with yourself. Be honest with your partners. Really challenge the thought process here to understand, does it fit here or does it fit somewhere else?
Mm-hmm. There's if you find yourself saying, well, we've always done that. We've always done it that way. Those things are sacred cows, and they are the best burgers to put on the grill. When you find yourself saying that, it's a good time to take a good hard look at what you're talking about and see if you can do it differently or stop doing it. Because the last thing we should do is keep doing something because we've always done it.
There are no, aside from the non-negotiable necessary items, I love that, there are no sacred cows in this exercise.
There's a great book, Sacred Cows Make the Best Burgers. Highly recommend. Back from my innovation days. Okay, our third bucket here is simplify. And this is part of what we were just talking about. What could we take here and do differently? And I would really encourage you to think about this in some unique ways. So one example of this that we worked on with a client is, like over our 6 years of work together, we've devised dozens of exercise scenarios that we have used on a small and large scale. Why create a new exercise scenario for 2023? That takes dozens of hours of time to put together. Why can't we just pull one from the library that we've used 4 or 5 years ago and use that again?
Yeah. Make little updates, make little tweaks, give some different dynamics. That's easy. Everything is already laid out for you.
What about articles? Maybe you've got a library of awareness articles. Don't write new ones.
No.
Take your old ones, review it for minor updates that are needed, use it again.
Yeah. You've had changes in personnel. It's changed since 4 years ago. Plus, there's nothing wrong with reminding folks about different.
Plus, I don't remember what I had
different ideas.
I don't remember what I had for dinner last night. So.
Well, that's true.
But I would really encourage you to think about, are there things that you've been doing in business continuity, crisis management, crisis communications that you could simplify, that you could do and approach differently? Are there things you can automate? Are there things you can outsource or subscribe to? Are there things that you can enable better through technology that you've been doing manually? Can you get a BC tool and reduce the time required to build a BC plan from 12 hours to 2? Those are all things that might make wise investments.
Yep. Right. Well, and I think some of the things that have even popped up that have come into, this bucket in particular is really on the, sort of the business side of the programs and things like that. So, how are you cost saving on the way that you process invoices or the way that you go out sourcing or where you're finding your information from? So are there better information sources that cut the cost down and you essentially get the same information? All those things that you can sort of simplify on that end too makes a huge difference in terms of, lowering that percentage threshold that you don't have to give up anything, within the program itself. Mm-hmm. You can do it sort of on the periphery.
Mm-hmm. And if there are things you're going to give up as a part of simplification, give up the things that don't add value.
Yeah.
As you simplify it, as you get rid of some of that stuff. I mean, I think a good example of this, there's a client we brought on board this year for business continuity as a service. So this is where we're running their BC program for them. We spent a whole month earlier this year taking a good hard look at the data they were capturing in their BC plan and their BIA as we were transitioning them to a tool because the tool is more productive. That good hard look at data led us to say, here's a whole bunch of stuff that are being captured today that we just don't need.
Yep.
We just don't need it. They were capturing a ton of real estate data, for example, about alternate workspace and where's the alternate workspace and what exact desk configuration do they need. And you know what? There's about 3 teams in that entire company that actually need an alternate physical site to do their work.
Yep.
Because everybody else can go home. because they did it during COVID. In fact, they're still there.
Yep.
So you have to be willing to think about this process differently. We probably trimmed a third of, I don't know, we didn't really measure this, but we probably trimmed at least a third of the required time to build out BIAs and BC plans at this client by getting rid of information that we just didn't need to capture anymore.
Oh, yeah. I mean, overall, we streamlined that, but just in that requirement gathering alone, it was probably a third of the time and resource.
Yeah. So the last bucket here is my favorite. It's just, what are we going to stop? What are we going to cut? And I think every one of these conversations, as we were helping clients with this year, I think every one of these conversations started with, well, we can't stop anything. And I'm like, oh, bullshit.
Not true. You challenge me often on being aggressive and sort of unforgiving in what can you stop doing?
Yeah.
What can you
I'm not going to do this
differently?
Anymore.
You know,
I'm not going to do these things anymore.
That's personal challenge to me. But so I think to your point, when everybody's like, well, no, I can't. No, you can. There's plenty once you dig into it.
What doesn't add value? So I don't have a good BC or DR or crisis example of this, but I have a simple one with this podcast. A while ago, we decided that we weren't going to include the music and the intro at the beginning and the outro at the end of our podcast episodes because honestly, none of you were coming here to listen to the intro to the podcast and the outro music and the credits. You already knew it was Bryghtpath and where to find our website. You knew how to get a hold of us if it's something you wanted to do.
I still don't understand that. I mean, the music was incredible.
Well, the music was great.
It set such a good tone. No.
Oh, I thought you were serious for a minute.
No, I was being entirely sarcastic.
But you know what? It was the part of the. But when it comes, because I edit the podcast, the process of editing the podcast, which I edited for a while, and then I was paying a service to edit the podcast, and I didn't like the expense, and that's really what they were doing.
Right.
Was splicing that together because I didn't like to do it.
You were paying to add the 10 minutes to make sure that the intro and outro
3 minutes
music was aligned.
So we just got rid of it. We didn't tell you. We just did it.
Yep.
But, I was inspired by that by listening to another podcast, The Business of Authority, Jonathan Stark and Rochelle Moulton, which is a great podcast. And, they were talking about their own podcast. Somebody had asked them about their podcast flow, and they were talking about how they go about the podcast. And Rochelle asked Jonathan, who kind of manages the podcast, what about editing? And he's like, we don't do any editing. I mean, every once in a while we really screw up and we'll clip something out. But he's like, I don't do any editing. I don't add in any music or anything at the beginning or end. The podcast starts when we start talking and it ends when we're done.
Hit record, hit stop.
And he was like, nobody comes to your podcast to listen to that stuff. And I'm like, oh, I'm totally going to do this. Because it didn't add value. And it didn't make any sense to do. And does it sound better? Well, I mean, maybe. Does it sound more professional? I don't know.
I don't know if it does. I think if you're doing something like a music-centric podcast or something that has audio or, audio as a focus or narrative as a focus or something like that, yeah, sure.
But so our message here is find the stuff that just doesn't add value, that you don't need to be doing, and just get rid of it.
Well, and it gets back to an earlier point I made around this piece too. And it might be something that has value to the organization, but does not have value to your team or is not a core component or process your team needs to own. Having those conversations, identifying it, making the case, and then identifying the right parts of the organization to put it in is also value added in this exercise. It takes it off your budget and your plate.
Who should own it? Make it move.
Yep.
Because you can't do it anymore. So we share all of this. One, we want to give it, a tool that has worked well for us. But past all of that, here's the leadership message at all of this. We talked a little bit about alignment at the beginning. So now let's just talk about the hard choices you got to make as a leader.
Yep.
If you've been challenged, if the organization has been challenged to reduce expense or to take a hard look at things we're doing and figuring out how we should do things differently, you are the subject matter expert. You are the leader of the function in your organization, and nobody there above you knows more about this than you do.
Correct.
You have to be the one to look hard at your program and say, here's how I want to evolve in the years to come to be more productive, to be more aligned, to reduce expense if that's the challenge. Because if you don't drive that, somebody who doesn't understand resilience and just thinks you're being reluctant to make decisions is going to make those decisions for you.
And they will not feel good.
They will not feel good, and they will be the wrong decisions. So it has to come from you. My personal story about this is a while back in the last recession, you were referencing 05, 06, 07. I was the head of innovation for a retailer on the security team. And one of the things that we saw coming, because we were running the project, was the rise of network-based video and the ability to look at video remotely as opposed to having to be at the site where the security video was. And as we were developing the technology and piloting the technology, my boss and I had a conversation one day that went along these lines. Bryan, if I can watch that video from anywhere, what do I actually need in a retail store from a security standpoint? And couldn't I do this differently with a different staffing model? And it wasn't that we didn't go into that conversation thinking about reducing headcount or reducing expense. It was, does this way we've done retail loss prevention since the initial VCR and video camera, is it going to be different because of this technology implementation that we're going to do, because of how technology could change the name of the game? And if that's true, how do we structure ourselves to do this differently? What does that mean for us? And what does it mean about our future talent?
Yep.
And that question consumed the next year and a half for me and my team and others that were a part of this conversation. I was just one player among many that worked on aspects of that. And my team did the heavy lifting on a lot of figuring out what should we do. At the end of the day, right before the economy took a crap in 08, 09, we made our own change. We drove the change. We, the security organization, said, we're going to centralize investigations. We're going to go to an intelligence-led model in the field. We're going to reduce the amount of resources that are assigned to individual stores. We're going to have more flexible-based intelligence teams that go where the data tells them. And a lot of these investigations are going to be centralized and done through remote video because we don't need to do them in the store.
Yep.
And it completely changed how we thought of investigations, how we thought of a staffing model. Wound up needing less resources, but we had more effective resources because this had all reinvented the way we do things.
It affected the way that other aspects of the organization looked at things, from merchandising, but then also coming from the field store to centralized crisis management for that same organization.
Yeah.
It innovated the way that we responded to things.
Yes.
And did our incident and crisis management.
What? There's an active shooter in a store? I can see that right now.
Yep. We're watching it right now.
So the message here is, as a leader, make the change yourself. Push that strategic change through. Take a good hard look at your organization, and don't be afraid to cut, to simplify, to determine what's really value added, and then protect your core program.
Drive your car, to bring back my earlier metaphor.
That's it for this edition of the Managing Uncertainty podcast. We'll be back next week with another new episode. Be well.